The Spurs have dodged a major bullet as we get a wild Trae Young update coming from Tim McMahon at ESPN. As reported, the RC Buford and the Spurs could have easily had Trae Young if they wanted to, but the Spurs went in a whole nother direction, of course, landing Chris Paul to pair with Wemby instead to ease some stress on Coach Pop. But this new update from Tim McMahon from ESPN reveals some pretty interesting details that has some Spurs fans rethinking their stance on this whole Trae Young position, but at the same time, some people are saying not to close the door just yet. There's a bunch of stuff we got to get into. This gets pretty deep, so stick around for all of this on this episode of Spurs Digest. But before we get into the video, as always, guys, 95% of you guys watching, that's thousands and thousands of you every single day, are not subscribed. It's completely free. Hit the button down below. You'll see our latest uploads. You'll get kept up to date on all the latest news, rumors, reports, everything to do with the San Antonio Spurs. But we're going to quickly get into the first topic of this video and the main topic of this video, and that is the fact that the Spurs have dodged a major bullet. Now, Trae Young has been in trade conversations seemingly forever with the San Antonio Spurs, at least over the last year or two since we got Wembanyama. It's like we need that point guard to pair with him, and yes, they got Chris Paul, but that hasn't quelled any of the people saying the Spurs need to go get Trae Young, the Spurs need this and that. And on paper, Trae Young, of course, is a good fit next to Wembanyama. Wemby's good at literally everything, but is obviously already elite defensively, already a favorite to win Depoy this year, while Trae Young elevates that offense to another level. So a lot of people said it was a natural fit. But the Spurs just never seem to make that trade, but it's not just them. No one seemed to, and we now have a bit more info as to why. As Tim McMahon, talking about Trae Young's value around the NBA, said, quote, if there was a real market for Trae Young, he'd be somewhere else right now. If the Spurs wanted Trae Young, they easily could have gone and gotten him. So this has, I think, a lot of Spurs fans rethinking, because how many of you guys have said, oh, you know, Trae Young is the perfect fit for the Spurs? Look, I get it. Like, he's a fantastic player. I'm just going to bring up his stats here. Like, Trae Young is a phenomenal player. 26 points a game, 11 assists per game. 47% of all his shots are threes, by the way, which is absolutely insane. And look at that corner three percentage. I know he doesn't shoot as many of those. Yeah, his field goal percentage is bad. Yeah, he has a ton of turnovers. I will say he has turned into a little bit of a better defender, but we'll do a deeper dive into his stats in just a little bit. But now we're looking, no one around the league even wanted Trae Young. It's not just the Spurs, no one around the league. And a further tweet here that I want to bring up from Spurs Report, they said basically it's the Spurs never wanted Trae Young. They didn't pass because they didn't have the money or the trade resources to make it happen. They passed because Trae simply lacks certain qualities they truly covet. Now, this isn't necessarily a report, but it's a very good point, and I kind of align with this stuff. Like, when you have the idea of Trae Young in your head, it's easy to look at this and say this is a match made in heaven, right? Trae Young and Victor Wembanyama, but at the same time, it's like you've heard some, not necessarily issues with Trae Young. I do think some of the stuff is overblown because of the way he plays, the way he acts, whatever. But like, yeah, he's great offensively. Yeah, he's a good passer. Yeah, he's a good shooter. Would it be bad to have him with Wemby? No. What I think would be bad is bringing in Trae Young and having him be the crux of your offense for years and years to come. If you're going into your contention window, that's where I think the Spurs have this issue with Trae Young. Specifically, if you have him as one of your top guys, your ceiling is very limited. At least in my opinion, I think in a lot of your guys' opinions too. To have a small point guard who is, in general, quite a net negative defensively, though again, he has improved a bit. I'll dive into that in a second. But to have him being maybe your primary scoring option, maybe your secondary, depending how Wemby progresses. I'm assuming Wemby's going to end up being the primary scoring option, but he's just going to be a scoring option at any moment, at any time. You can't deny Trae Young's a good scorer too. He'll be able to put up 25 a game. But having him as that guy, a guy that's vulnerable to having, people really swarm him. He's a smaller guy. He can get physically punished a little bit more in the playoffs, right? There are so many worries with building your whole team around a guy like Trae Young that the Spurs didn't want to go and get him. And now I'm going to go into a bit more of a deep dive on the stats as to just why I see, this doesn't make sense to me. Because the Spurs, if you're a team that you're building around Wemby, yeah, you need a bunch of great offensive talent. You're going to need some guys that can fill those roles around him, but you need guys that can fill those roles while being off ball, while letting Wemby do his thing, while also being able to get Wemby the ball. Chris Paul is a fantastic fit right now, but that's also because even though Chris Paul is old, he's still not that bad defensively, right? He is one of the better perimeter defenders of this era. Of course, the longtime steal leader of the NBA, season after season, not all time, of course, season after season, he had that big steal streak. Chris Paul is still a great defender, and he's a solid shooter, and he is still right up there with the best playmakers in the game. But you bring in a guy like Trae Young, and I wanted to flash up his advanced stats specifically, and I sorted this by defensive box plus minus. Now, To be fair, something like a defensive box plus minus, it doesn't paint the whole picture. I like it a bit more than defensive rating when you're using defensive rating just for one player. It can get a bit funky, but when we're talking about defensive BPM, he's never had a season that's better than negative 1.7. And box plus minus basically just, over 100%, over 100 possessions to simplify this, kind of your defensive impact on the team versus if you were kind of off the court for someone else, right? So it's kind of simplifying it. You can go check out Basketball Reference. There's a great glossary for it. But at the end of the day, his 2023-24 season, as you can see, was his second worst career DBPM behind only his rookie season in 2018-19. His offensive box plus minus has been really good every year. You look, he's leading the league in assist percentage, but his turnover percentage is also very high. His defensive win shares are not getting there. Those defensive metrics are not there for him. And when you have, I know you have Wemby as like a failsafe, but the last thing you want to do if you're the Spurs is have a guy who is so vulnerable on the perimeter that you almost feel like, okay, it's okay to have Wemby as a failsafe, but to have the point of attack defender being so vulnerable long term, we're talking 2, 3, 4, 5 every single year, to that point of attack basically. Even you can attack Trae on switches. You can, if he's just guarding whatever point guard it is, whether it's Kyrie or maybe even someone bigger, who knows, whoever it may be, Trae is going to be vulnerable, and you don't want to force them. You don't want to force Wemby into having to cover for Trae Young's lapses over and over, because teams will be able to game plan then to try and see how they can manipulate Trae Young so that they can in turn manipulate Wemby to come out of the paint. We're getting a bit too deep into this maybe. Maybe I'm overthinking this. Maybe I'm just trying to convince myself that now that we see Trae Young is off the market, or, he has no market, that this was the right decision on the Spurs to pass on him. But I mean, the more I look at it, the more I'm like, look, I was convinced of this before, but the more I dive into this, the more I understand why teams were not willing to give up the farm for him, right? And the Spurs are actually one of the teams that are in the best position to do so, as that tweet kind of highlighted. Like, if we look at what the Spurs have upcoming, I'll make that a bit bigger for you. Like, look at all these draft picks just in 25 and 26. Now, not all of these are going to convey, right? There's some protections here and there. They'll move on, but like, just this year, 4 first-round picks. A couple of them, Charlotte and Chicago, are probably not going to convey. Those picks will probably end up in the bottom 14 and bottom 10 respectively. But we still got that Atlanta no protection pick. We still got the Atlanta pick swap in 2026. That's probably what Atlanta would have wanted back in the Trae Young trade. But what the Spurs are doing here is doing exactly what long-term successful dynasties do, like the Spurs have done before even, right? You get a lot of draft capital and you build your team up while having that draft capital. It's what the Thunder are doing now, and they were just the 1 seed, right? They got an MVP candidate in Shea, and they have Chet, and they have J-Dub. They have so many amazing players like Lou Dort, and they're building a team that's going to be good for a long time, and that's exactly what the Spurs are doing now. Are you willing to mortgage that kind of future asset pool for a guy like Trae Young that you're not necessarily convinced is going to be that guy that gets you over the hump, that guy that can lead your team from the 1 spot to a championship? Look, it's not just the Spurs either. It seems like no team in the NBA is confident that Trae Young's going to be able to do this. As I flash his stats up one last time for you guys, just to have another quick look. Is this the guy? At this point, I know we're just rehashing stuff. It's old news. Trae Young is not going to the Spurs. It certainly seems like it, though. I will say there are a couple of Spurs outlets that I've seen, whether it's on Twitter or whether it's online, some articles and stuff saying, don't close the door on Trae Young forever. And hey, I'm not willing to shut it forever. But at this moment, to me, I think the Spurs managed to dodge this big Trae Young bullet, I guess you could say. It's not like I think he's a bad player. I think he's a very good player. I think he's an elite offensive talent. I just don't think he's the guy that leads the Spurs to the promised land. But let me know what you guys think. What do you think specifically about Trae Young not having a trade market around the NBA at all? Teams are just not willing to pay the price it would take to get him. They just lost DeJounte Murray. They might be better without DeJounte Murray next to Trae Young, honestly, but we'll just have to wait and see. Maybe Trae can up his trade value this year, and who knows, maybe the Hawks will end up getting a haul, but I'm just saying, I got a funny feeling that it won't be the Spurs anytime soon. That'll do it for this episode of Spurs Digest. If you enjoyed, leave a like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Thank you all for watching every single day on Spurs Digest. Your support's been incredible, and we hope it continues well into the season. I'm your host, Josh Gosse. I'll catch you in the next one.